the 8th edition of the Sofia International Literary Festival. This is the third day, where we have the pleasure of Selja Ahava being here with us, albeit online. You maybe know her book, Things That Fall from the Sky. I'm holding Before My Husband Disappears, her new book. Selja Ahava is online with us, and we'll have one of her greatest fans talking with her, Kremena Dimitrova. The interpreters are Yoana, Stoyanova, and Martin Petrov. I leave you with Kremena Dimitrova and Selja Ahava. Hello. I'll have to put my headphones on and off so I don't hear my own voice when I'm talking, because it is a schizophrenic condition anyway. I feel a bit like Alice in Wonderland against this wonderful background behind me, and I do feel like I'm in a different reality. But this situation perhaps helps me emerge better in Selja Ahava's novels, and I do really love them. Her because I already led the first interview with her 3 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, when we presented her first book, Things That Fall from the Sky. The novel won the EU Literature Prize for 2016. I'll begin with a few words on why I like Selja Ahava so much, and I will address those who still have not read anything by her in an attempt to arouse their curiosity and read at least one of the two novels, why not both? Firstly, her style and her topics are very different from anything we know. She has a taste for writing stories where she intertwines parallel stories, and in a way they blend into each other, and the way she does it is incredible and very unexpected. It borders with poetry and philosophy, and if I have to describe it with a visual metaphor, it's like putting some milk in your coffee. These are basically two different liquids that might even have a different temperature. One is cold and the other is hot. But watching how one blends into the other gives you a feeling of whirlwind, like in Alice. You're in two worlds and in a third world in the same time. You're drinking coffee and milk, but you're actually drinking a third liquid, which has another taste, which you create by regulating the quantity of milk and coffee. And that's the feeling of Things That Fall from the Sky. There are several parallel storylines. I'm not going to spoil it for you, but it is narrated from the point of view of an 8-year-old girl, and that is very impressive. The book deals with such as doors falling off planes. In this case, a huge piece of ice falls and kills the girl's mother, and that is how the book begins. Selja has an interest in the absurd, the unexpected, the unexplainable. That was what her first novel was like, a novel that was more about accidents rather than the search for a different world. Her new novel, which was published very recently, Before My Husband Disappears, deals more with illusions, with how solid illusions are and how we refuse to accept that illusions are indeed illusions. Here it is much more strict. One is the illusion of discovering India, but actually discovering America. And the other is the story of a woman who faces the illusion of accepting that her husband, after 10 years of marriage, decides to change their gender. Now, this is already described on the back of the book. The novel deals with these two illusions that happen in a different time and space. One is a global illusion, the other is a very personal one. And the novel maps these two illusions. It maps loss. So it it has a very strong impact, and Selja very masterfully intertwines these two storylines. So my first question would be, Selja, how did you have this idea of putting together Columbus's illusion with that of this wife and her husband? Was it a chance, or was it something you searched for a long time?
Thank you for that introduction. I love the coffee metaphor of the blend. I really like that. The idea for this book, actually, before I even had an idea of what I'm going to write about, I was interested in having a historical level in the book, and I was looking for the right era and the right person or the right country, but wasn't really clear about what I'm after. Then something quite unexpected happened in my own life, and suddenly, like magical realism entered my life. And as my then husband started the trans identification process, and I had a need to record what was happening, but I also wanted to somehow capture with words this phase, this quite short period, really, when it felt like all the words that had a specific meaning, beginning with words like man and woman, known and unknown, truth, lie, and so forth, they just lost their meaning. And then I remembered Christopher Columbus. And I was asking, was it really so that he never realized that he actually didn't find India? That he traveled 4 times back and forth. He was able to navigate. He was really talented. It was an incredible act to be able to navigate and use the winds and the currents in a particular way to make that journey. And he did it 4 times. And the map that he had was actually Marco Polo's map from 200 years earlier, which described the Chinese coastline. And with this map, he was able to navigate and hold on to this idea that he is in India. Although everything around him was really contradicting what he saw, what he didn't see, wasn't really anything like what Marco Polo had described. And I found that reading of reality really touching in the situation that I was in my own life then. That's something that I knew or thought I had known turned out to be something so different. So these 2 stories just resonated really strongly. to me. And then the more I read about Columbus, the more the resonation kind of got stronger.
Вероятно, връзката между двете истории
I'm guessing this resonance between the two stories that is basically one reality taking the place of another, one truth taking the place of another, whether consciously or not, whether Columbus consciously presented what he discovered as India, whether a woman is conscious of living with one person or that person is actually different. My reading of this novel is that it has a lot of signs in it. What's in common between the two stories is what Tsvetan Todorov studies in The Conquest of America, namely the conquest of the other, power over the other, conquering the other, is done through changing signs. In your case, the second storyline, that of the husband and the wife refuses to accept the new signs. She refuses to conquer the new territory, to take it as hers. She refuses to be conquered by the new truth. Unlike Columbus, who does impose the new signs, he does impose the signs of Christian Europe on the supposed Indians who turn out to be Native Americans. And so he supports his illusion. Am I right in using this comparison with Tsvetan Todorov's Conquest of America? And to what extent were signs symbols of any importance to you in writing the novel?
Yes, the book operates, as you said, in making comparisons between Columbus and the way he names the places he sees, and the way the woman, the narrator, names her husband. And there are lists in the book, like between the chapters, you have lists of things that you gradually as a reader understand that are about to disappear. So there's one list of place names that Columbus gave, like islands, sea bays, peninsulas, and they are all names that have disappeared now because the places have been renamed. And then there's a list of physical details of the husband's male body that are also going to disappear. But it's like, and the narrator in the book, she says that this is, I'm going to map you now what I'm bound to lose. So before he disappears, I will draw a map of him for you. And you can see it as a beautiful act, a remembrance act, because we're dealing with loss. But you can also see it as a violent, conqueror's act. That I name you, I tell what you are, and don't you dare to change. So there's these both aspects in this whole act of writing this book and what the narrator is doing.
Жената като че ли пише...
The woman seems to be writing an epitaph of the woman, of the man, whom she's used to taking as body and soul, but it turns out the body is no longer the body she remembers, the body she knows. She maps this body and writes an epitaph of this body that's about to disappear. So she's basically doing a ritual burial of this body. It's about to disappear, her husband's about to disappear. She buries his shirts, and this reminds me of Antigona and how important it is to bury the body, and to what extent is the body important in our perception of the other. So my question is, to what extent is the body important in the way we perceive our loved ones?
A very personal question, and I know that the answers really vary. And I think this is something that maybe we don't discuss so often with others, and we just presume that others feel the same as we do. And when I've been meeting readers with this book, I've realized that the audience often expresses ideas about the way they feel about the relationship with the body and love and so forth. And I can see that they presume that everybody else experiences the same. Whereas actually we are very different, and there are people to whom the physical body or the gender of the body is not so important or relevant. And sometimes you don't know before you are challenged, because you don't have to. Especially if you belong to the majority, if you are heterosexual, for instance, you don't have to challenge yourself. Like, where is the boundary for me? I think this is one of the things that the narrator in the book is sort of struggling. Like how, like if I start losing bits of the man in the person that I love, what is left? How much is left? And is there enough for me to love? Am I loving the person, and is it so that the body doesn't matter? Or is it so that I am actually loving the gender in him, and that if he stops being him, I can't accept this new person? And it's very confusing and complex. So this is the process that I try to grasp with words in the book.
Изключително много харесвам липсата на категоричност в...
I very much like the lack of absolute truth in the novel, the lack of absolute truth in the answers the narrator gives. She refuses to accept her husband's change of gender, but she does not completely refuse her love for him. So in the novel, there is this question of identity. To what extent is identity connected to gender? And so we do find out that, yes, it is very connected, and this change of gender does seem to make this person a completely different person, who changes not only the way they look, but also their name and all the signs of their identity. So this change of gender seems to be the birth of a new person. This is a way to create a new person. So in this case, we're discovering a new America. The coming into being of this new person is basically the discovery of a new continent, which is completely unknown to your character, and she refuses to conquer it. She decides to leave it as it is. The topic of identity and gender is very much discussed in the last years, and in a conversation we had with you some time ago, You said that your novel in the countries where it has been translated, hopefully it would be translated in more countries, depending on to what extent the topic of gender and transsexuality, gender roles is something that is being discussed in that society. I wanted to ask you about your experience so far. You mentioned that your novel has been translated in Denmark and Slovenia. What are your expectations? How was it accepted in your own country?
Yes, the reception was very divided. So there were those readers who really empathized with the narrator, even to there was a kind of curiosity element there. It was like having a peek in somebody's experience. And they were not very open for the Columbus part of the book and found it a bit frustrating. And then there were those people who found the book offensive because it blocks the other voice, the other person, the other perspective off completely. So the voice of the book is very the frame is very tight, and we only hear the narrator's side of the story. And there's like a mirror image for this story, which is the husband's experience, and we only get like little glimpses of what is happening to him and her. So it is simultaneously a story of a birth, and then from the other perspective, it is a story of death and loss. I deny, by writing only the narrator's story, I deny the other perspective. The problem is that there is so little written about transgender experience in literature still. This is gradually changing, especially in the children's literature and young adult literature. We are beginning to have books that portray sex and gender minorities in a positive way and give them a voice, which is really, really good, because then those children can identify in a positive way and get words and images for what they are feeling and experiencing. And they don't have to spend so many years like my ex-husband did. You know, you could say that she wasted 40 years of her life by trying to be something that she wasn't. I hope that trans children who are born today don't have to go through that way of living for many, many reasons.
You seem to blame yourself for not having given us the opportunity to read the other perspective, the husband's point of view. But I didn't feel that as a problem, because I didn't read your novel as an accusation where both parties need to be given a voice. Quite on the contrary, I read the woman's point of view and I do empathize with her. I do try to put myself in her shoes, and I suffer with her suffering. And to me, that's enough for me to feel catharsis and for this novel to have an impact on me. And the story made me think of a lot of other stories and novels. I kept remembering the film Danish Girl, a wonderful film with Alicia Vikander, where there's also a story of change of gender and the perception of the other. So I do not blame your character, your narrator. I understand her, I empathize with her. And this story reminded me of the story of Grøndal, this Danish writer who wrote the novel Silence in October, which tells of a man abandoned by his wife and who's trying to understand why his wife left him, but he doesn't blame her. We don't hear the wife's perspective, who probably had her reasons, but we do empathize with the man who is in this situation of absolute solitude. So to me, this is a novel that makes us empathize rather than just being one-sided and showing just one perspective. To me, the important thing is this comparison of the two storylines and this huge metaphor of mapping life in illusion, which will flash at us as a red lamp because each of us lives with their illusions and maintains them because it's easier for us. It's inevitable for people in the 21st century who are melancholic people, and to us, I think life of illusion is inevitable. To me, this is a very powerful novel, and I don't feel that the other point of view is lacking in any way. I would like to ask our moderator whether we have questions from the audience, because I have lots of questions, but I don't want to deprive our listeners of the opportunity to ask theirs. A moment.
Аз като модератор да кажа, че...
As a moderator, let me just say that we don't have any questions.
Аз мога да използвам паузата, докато търсим въпроси.
We're going to use this pause, waiting for questions, to ask a few of my own. I'd like to ask her about the way she built her writing style, because it's very characteristic, very peculiar and easily identifiable as hers. For people who don't know her, I'd just say that she studied script writing for the radio, TV. So she, so to say, came from another type of media, but she was an experienced writer. Script writing requires a specific set of skills. I say this as someone with a 15 years experience in theater, and you need to really be a master of dialogue. This is something, well, dialogue isn't a straightforward and metaphoric. It's you could say that it's a poetry in prose. What she said about naming places and mapping in the novel we are talking about now, it can even be said to be a bit like haiku. I think poetry penetrates her writing. And I'd like to ask, do you consciously avoid dialogue? And what are your influences in the building of your style, which is really captivating?
Interesting question about the lack of dialogue. No, I don't make deliberate decisions there. I think one of the things that I love about writing prose is the narrator voice. And of course, this is the very element that I lose when I write drama, because drama doesn't have narrator. Also, in comparison to script writing, when I'm writing books, I am in charge of everything from the very beginning to the end, and it satisfies me more as an author not to have to share or give away the script for somebody else halfway through the process. I operate often like quite concrete little details about reality, and then sort of recycle them through the book so that they begin to be loaded with other meanings. When I repeat the same sentence or the same image in a new place in the book, it gathers new meanings. So expressions get more depth during the process of the book. And I think this is something that some people define poetic. I think if I could have, I think I found poetry quite appealing, but I could never write poems. And in a way, drama was a bit like one solution to that problem, because drama is so much based on what is left unsaid. There's so much importance in the between the lines. And that is very similar to poetry. And I think there's an element of that also in my prose, that I try to compress and condense things. My books are never very long, and I think this is the reason, because I always consider what I can leave out. So there are gaps and holes and missing bits in all my books. And it requires a certain amount of input and activity from the reader, because they are not given everything. They have to maybe work a little bit.
Аз трябва да си призная за моята стратегия на четене на твоите книги, че...
I have to admit that as a strategy of reading your books, first I read them in a PDF format because that's how I receive them. Then I wait for the book to come out in print. Then I reread it for my own pleasure, so I can have a feel of the physical book and to be able to immerse myself in it. So here I see what you're saying about leaving things unsaid and leaving gaps between things that are committed to paper. And if during my first reading I try to follow the plot, during my second reading I already know where the plot is going, so I'm reading for my personal pleasure, just to be able to really dive into these gaps and spaces. But this is my personal strategy. I don't know whether other readers do that or even have the time to, but for me personally, this type of writing, well, it refers me to Maeterlinck and Pinter's place where silences, ambiguities, things left unsaid are very important and central. It seems like more happens there than what is actually being said. So I really don't think that these books are not amenable to being rewritten as a different genre. Yes, they lack too much of actual dialogue, but you as a writer, you are also the narrator, but you do a great job of transforming into both Columbus and the woman who loses her husband. So these books could also be radio plays, mono plays, one-person plays for the stage. So I'd like to ask you whether this has ever been attempted with your books. We had a bit of a talk with you that you have had proposals for adapting your work for the film. Could you tell us a bit more about your experience with adapting your work for the stage or film?
Yes, there's been some interest in making the previous novel, Things That Fall from the Sky, into a film. So I've been in touch with a filmmaker about that, and we'll see. So that's very early days. When Before My Husband Disappears came out in Finland, I received about 5 invitations for a film or stage adaptation during the first week. So there was, and I understand it's a very concrete and dramatic setup for a drama, to have a married couple and then the physical transformation. This is all, I can see why it appeals to theatre people, film people. But for me, the core of that book is not really the story of the couple. It is the story of only the woman and her experience. And if it had been adapted, then the whole question of perspective and 2 characters would have been, it would have been basically a completely different story. And I didn't see it as a possibility. So I have said no to all the requirements.
Разбирам, че има въпроси от...
I understand we have questions from readers now. I just ask if it's possible to ask another question personally. Yes, of course, you'd be able to ask another question. Now, the readers are interested in the political dimensions of this difficult topic. So here's one question. Selja, what is your opinion of transphobia and its political goals, objectives? A book that maybe your book will be censored, denied by transphobes, targeted by them. And I'd like to also ask, how do you manage to separate your personal life from your fiction, especially concerning this book? And do we all need this kind of storms in our lives, quakes, or is it better that they remain in fiction and this should be our only way to experience them? What do you think?
Well, I start with the last question. We don't choose the storms that we get in our lives. We don't get to choose whether our children stay healthy and so forth. They are things that happen to us, and that's that. The political aspect of this book, of course, is depends on the country that is published in. And this is why it is a little bit tricky for me, because I don't know what the situation in a specific country is, what minorities in that country are, what has been written before my book, and what sort of voices in that country have space and right to be expressed. So all this affects the way the book is written. I understand if the transgender issue is difficult for people, and that they might feel the same difficulty then is reflected in reading this book. But I think sometimes it's also the purpose of literature to take us to difficult places. The literature can and should also challenge us and take us to places that are uncomfortable and new. Just like Columbus takes his crew over the edge of the known world, I think sometimes literature has to do the same. And I hope that even though the perspective of this book is limited to the narrator, by sharing my experience, I can show that this is like minority issues are not really, you know, something that we can block out, that this doesn't concern me, this doesn't concern my life, my family, because we are not like that. Because you never know. And you know, my ex-husband came from she's English, so and she came from a sort of working class background, quite narrow-minded countryside England. So your identity is not something that it's not like only the academic urban people get trans children. Somehow I hope the book can reflect on the complexities around the issue and kind of make it a bit more concrete and less scary, maybe.
Имаме ли още въпроси, за да продължа с...
Any other questions, or can I ask one of mine? Yes, we do.
Един от тях е как трансобщността реагира на книгата. Тоест, самите транс хора как...
How did the trans community receive your book? How did you have any reactions from trans people themselves?
Yes, as I said, the reaction was quite strong, and I think it is a lot to do with the fact that there was such a huge need for a book that was actually telling about them. And this book wasn't that book. So the reaction was not by all, of course. Trans people, as everybody else, is a mixed bunch of people. But I think there was a lot of disappointment in the decision not to describe the trans experience of finding your identity and becoming what you really are. And but that's a different story. And yes, there is a need for those stories. But this was a different story. This is a new book, a different book, and so from my perspective, it was sometimes a little bit frustrating that I felt like the book and the discussion around the book was kind of hijacked somewhere where I didn't aim at.
Надежда? Имаме ли още въпрос?
Any more questions?
Можеш да... добре, секунда, тук
Just a sec.
идват. Този го зададохме, колегите помагат.
We did that one. Okay.
Много за разграничаването.
Maybe again, coming back to distinguishing between personal life and fiction. Could you go a bit more into that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I've been very, well, it's a big question actually, how fiction and real life experience intertwine. Many people have the idea that first you experience something and then you transform it into a fictional form. And that's how it works. But actually it is a much more complex back and forth process. Like the fact that I first wrote Things That Fall from the Sky, which tells about different people in situations that they are suddenly thrown into when life totally pulls the rug from underneath their feet. And they just don't know how to continue. And when I was about to finish that book, my then husband came out, and suddenly I was behaving and feeling just like the characters in my book were, that I had just been writing for 2 years. So it was a bit weird experience to like, and I know other authors experience the same sometimes, that first you write about something and then it happens. So it's not so simple. When it comes to writing about your personal life, you have to be very careful with boundaries. So I made quite clear rules with the publisher about interviews, and I didn't give any interviews for women's magazines and so forth. So as long as it was cultural focus on cultural things, and the focus was on the book, I accepted. And then, and also I didn't, I had made a contract with my ex-husband that I won't describe her experience or her feelings, that I don't verbalize his thoughts because I don't know them. So I only stuck to my own perspective for that reason as well. And every time I had an interview, I always made certain things clear with the interviewer beforehand, like I want to be discussing calling the narrator and not me, because they're two different things. The narrator is a fictional construction, even though the experience she's describing has a link to my personal experience. But there are huge things that I've left out, like the fact that we have 2 children. And this is, again, they have a different perspective. They have their own story, but they own that story. I don't have a right to go there. And they can make decisions on how they want to share their story and with whom. So in these sort of decisions, I was very clear.
Тъй като имаме много малко време до края на този разговор, аз искам...
Since we have very little time left, I'd like to take you in another direction and ask you two questions to do with the year we are currently living in. This is a year that had a lot of challenges for all of us. And my first question is, what illusions did we have to part with during 2020? Because in a way, your book is a book about saying goodbye to illusions. And the second question is using another motive from your book. The narrator is praying for a miracle So I'd like to ask you, what are you praying or hoping for right before Christmas?
Yeah, I think this year is a good example of how life can take a strange turn, and many things that we thought that are irreplaceable in our day-to-day life, suddenly they just all went out of the window, and we realized that actually we managed without them. It's quite weird, really, to realize that suddenly, I don't travel, people don't go to their workplace, children drop out of school. The schooling is suddenly capable or possible through online connections and so forth. Yeah, I mean, in many ways, I personally have had to give up very little because my life, I work from home anyway and live quite a free and isolated. Not so different. Now I forgot your second question. Miracles. I don't know. I was hoping, maybe for environmental reasons, that this experience of having to stop everything and everything, that it would make us understand that if we want to, we can make huge changes in our lifestyle and actually do something for the sake of the planet and the future. But as time passes, I don't feel too optimistic about that now, to be honest.
И на финала ще те попитам, занимаваш ли се още с...
Finally, I'd like to ask you if
No, the garden is a mess because it was my ex-husband's world. So as we separated, I was left with the house and the way too big garden. So for several years, the garden was like the symbol of things that had happened. But now I've kind of my way around it, so I manage. But yes, we used to have a lovely garden.
На финала аз само ще пожелая...
Finally, I'd like to wish you and your children health, and I hope your garden turns out fine, and I hope we manage to translate your latest novel and be able to read it here in Bulgaria very soon.
I hope so too.
Също благодаря на
Our next discussion, we will talk about our own realm, our own country. We'll be talking about a collection of stories, Bulgaria for advanced learners. We expect you back in half an hour.